Hello there, it's so good to have you with me as we take a look at another psalm. One of the things I love increasingly about the psalms is the sheer variety that we have within our Bibles. There are different types of psalms, many of which contain prayers and laments and heartfelt cries to God. But just as there are different types of psalms, within the psalms there are different types of prayer. And that's true of our everyday spiritual experience as well, isn't it? There really isn't just one way to approach God in prayer. Sometimes, you may remember back in Psalm 70, the situation is so urgent and the danger is so great that all we can do is sort of fire off a salvo prayer at God. Help! And that's what happens really in Psalm 70, that very short psalm of just 5 verses. But here we come to Psalm 74, where we are today, and we have an example of a prayer that is really clearly well thought out and reasoned and structured. It's been carefully put together to make a strong case in pleading to God. In fact, Spurgeon says of this psalm, it's an example of how we can pray to God with arguments. We're not given a specific historical setting for this psalm, but there is really only one historical event from the Old Testament history that fits the bill. And that's the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC, when the city was destroyed, the temple was razed to the ground, and the vast majority of the people were taken away into exile in Babylon. And when you read particularly verses 4 through to 8, you have the graphic, dramatic, heartbreaking account of what happened in that situation. It's almost as if the psalmist is taking God on a guided tour of the ruins and the devastation, looking at the rubble, seeing the complete destruction that had been brought about by the enemies. And remember too that that's the report, that sort of report that reached Nehemiah over in Babylon, as is recorded in the opening verses of the book that bear his name. So as we come to Psalm 74, the psalmist begins in the first 3 verses with a gut-wrenching cry of lament to God. Why have you done all this? And notice that in a reverent sense, he holds God responsible, not in an accusatory way, but submissively recognizing the sovereign hand of God, even in the terrible actions of God's foes. See verse 1, why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? But notice too the faith that is expressed in a sense as the ground of his prayer, of his appeal to God. And this fact, I think, is the key to really understanding and applying this psalm in our own lives. 4 times in the psalm, twice in verse 2, once in verse 18, once in verse 22, the psalmist calls on God to remember your congregation, and to remember Mount Zion in verse 2, to remember the scoffing of the enemy in verses 18 and again in verse 22. And in very similar vein, in verse 20, he calls on God to have regard for the covenant, and in verse 23, do not forget the clamour of the enemy. So again and again he's asking God, calling on God to remember, to bear in mind and act accordingly. So in verses 1 to 3, you have the psalmist's searching question and plea. How long is this going to go on for? Then in verses 4 to 8, you have, that we've already referred to, you have the physical destruction that would be wreaked by the enemy of God's people. In verses 9 to 11, you have the spiritual plight of the people of God. There are now no prophets left to be heard. And in the absence of the prophets, there's no communication from God. And so there's a sense of hopelessness. None among us knows how long, says the psalmist in verse 9. And you can sense the real despair in the psalmist's voice there. This is the lowest point of the psalm. But notice too, he recognizes the real object of the enemy's wrath is not Judah or Jerusalem or the people of God. It's actually God himself. So look at verse 10. How long, O God, is the foe to scoff, is the enemy to revile your name forever? Back in verse 4, he described them as your foes. And then he cries to God at the end of that stanza in verse 11. He cries to God to take action, because when he looks at God, it almost seems as if God is standing back with his hands in his pockets, as it were. And so he calls on God to roll up his sleeves, do something, destroy your enemies. Now the psalmist, and I hope you and I too, had absolutely no doubt that God could act and destroy his enemies in a moment. And the proof lies in what God has done in the past. So he doesn't only call on God to remember something, he himself remembers something. So verses 12 to 17, he recounts numerous ways in which in the past God has made bare his arm and defended or delivered or provided for his people in one dramatic way or another. His God and our God is the truly sovereign and omnipotent God who rules over the very forces of nature and all the physical elements of the universe. And so he calls on this God to act in the present situation. So God, he says, it's in your very nature to make your name great and to defend your cause. If ever there was a time when that was needed, God, it's now. It's now. Friends, I don't know about you, but as I look around the Church of Jesus Christ today, certainly in my own country, I can identify easily with the Asaph who wrote this psalm. I know that we haven't been physically invaded in the way that they were in that situation. I know we haven't been destroyed in that sense by an army. But you know, in so many ways, as Nehemiah expressed it when he heard the news from Jerusalem, we can cry out to God as we observe the Church of Jesus Christ today that the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. And we ought to, like Nehemiah, weep and mourn for many days. There is much to weep and to mourn over in the church today. We have been subtly invaded by an army of unbelief and worldliness and apostasy. And the ruins are everywhere to be seen. The church, in so many respects, lies in ruins. So let's cry to God on the strength of this great psalm. Let's cry to God to remember his people, to remember his covenant, to take note of the scoffing derision of our enemies, inside and outside of the church. And let's plead with him to do what he has often and so powerfully done in the past, to make bare his arm, to revive, restore, and renew his church in this, our day and our generation. Let's order our prayer. Let's argue our prayer. Let's plead our prayer for the glory of God and the sake of his name. The Lord bless you and the Lord keep you.